Hello, everyone, and welcome to Florida Coastal School of Law's LLM Program's online speaker series event. I'm Margaret Ioannidis, the Associate Dean of Strategy and Innovation, and with us today is our guest speaker, Professor Jim Caine. We thank all of you for joining us from around the world, and before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of basic rules for today's webinar. We are recording today's event, so we do ask that all of you mute your microphones until the end of today's webinar, when we will have time for live question and answer. During the webinar, please feel free to use the chat feature on the left-hand side of the screen. If you send the message to presenters, only Professor Caine and I will receive those. We'll do our best to also answer any questions that come in through the chat feature, as well as those that come in at the end of today's webinar. So without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. Professor Caine teaches in the area of government contracting and acquisitions, and he is actually a professor in our logistics and transportation program as well. He teaches the course Government Contracts and Procurement, and I know that some of you participating today are actually in his class this semester. He's a practicing government contracts attorney with 29 years of experience with the Department of Homeland Security, the Air Force, the Department of Justice, and the Navy. Professor Caine has also served 30 years in the Army and Air Force Reserves, and 13 years as an Army infantry officer, and 17 years as an Air Force judge advocate with deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. He lives in Fernandina Beach, which is right near Jacksonville, for those of you who are joining us from around the world, and he lives with his wife, Minta, and dog, Dinah. And it is our pleasure and honor to have you here today, Professor Caine. We look forward to your wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, as always, Margaret. It's great to be here. For everyone, I want to be very clear. I'm only going to go 45 to 50 minutes, so there's going to be plenty of time for questions, and I welcome any questions that you have. To just set a little bit of background about this talk today, I was living in Middle Georgia, working for the Air Force as a government contract attorney, and was about 20 years, 22, 23 years into what ultimately was a 30-year military career. And had never deployed anywhere ever. And I just thought it was my turn or time. So I was actually a volunteer. What was kind of funny about this deployment is I was just a regular Air Force JAG. And when I put the uniform on, sometimes I try to pretend to forget that I'm a government contracts attorney. And I just want to be a regular Air Force attorney, you know, doing things like letters of reprimand, claims, legal assistance. And so I very much just wanted to deploy to help some random air wing deployed in either Iraq or Afghanistan. Well, by that time, I had about 23 years of government contracts experience. The people who were in charge took one look at my resume and decided that I needed to go to the Joint Contracting Command for Iraq and Afghanistan, which is located in Baghdad, Iraq. I was there from about September of 2006 to about February of 2007. Lest any of the veterans out there are thinking, this poor guy, he had to do 2 whole years in Iraq. No, I think I did about 5 months. It just spanned over 2 years. So I wanted to give you that as just a little bit of background. And now I want to show you a couple pictures that I think really illustrate the really unique and sort of almost surreal or bizarre aspect of deploying to Baghdad in 2006, 2007 timeframe. So the first is a pool, and not a bad pool, right? This is a beautiful swimming pool at one of Saddam Hussein's palaces. People routinely went there and swam laps. You would see people sunbathing. It was beautiful. It was near the U.S. Embassy. There were even probably 100 parakeets and other birds that Saddam used to keep in cages right around the corner. And so you look at that and you were like, what is this guy talking about a deployment? We sent him to Club Med for 5 months. But then there's this. The last week I was there, this is the building where my room was located. And of course, as things always work out in a deployment, again, the veterans may know, bad stuff always happens at the end. You never worry about anything till it's time to go home. And then you start to worry about things. And then something like this happens where a rocket hit the building where I lived. And so, you know, in essence, it was a very surreal deployment because being in the green zone, especially doing office work, was very much a mix of a very comfortable environment, but with sort of lurking danger. You know, on the comfort side, you have access to great food. We had VoIP telephones that we could call home to. I had a computer. I had internet. The food was good to great. They served lobster every Sunday night. When I was about 4 or 5 weeks from going home, one of my people who worked with me mocked up a picture with 8 lobster tails to signify 2 lobster tails per week, and I had 4 weeks left to go. My poor wife back home immediately sent a picture with 8 cups of ramen noodle because she was saving all the money I was sending home to do some cool projects around the house. So we ate really well. So you have all that, but on the other hand, again, you have rockets, indirect fire, occasional sniping, and so it was just a really unique environment. So what are we going to talk about today? Because we obviously want to make this a little bit more about than just Jim telling war stories for 50 minutes. So the way I've structured this lecture today, I want to talk a little bit about the environmental factors of any stressful situation, and particularly a combat deployment. And particularly, I want to focus on their impact on brain work. I've come to think a lot about this since my deployment, and it occurs to me that what we do as lawyers, where we often have to come up with creative, innovative solutions that require hard thinking, can be impacted to a much greater degree by environmental factors than maybe if somebody just tells you to dig a fighting position. And I'm not minimizing that. I've dug fighting positions and digging a hole in the ground with a small shovel. There's nothing easy about that. But I found I was able to do that when I was tired, exhausted, stressed out, confused by the environment. It's a much more difficult challenge doing lawyer work. And I want to just talk about some of the factors that you can encounter and some of the professional adaptations that I applied in my job as being a lawyer to help me get beyond some of the environmental factors. Then the second part of the lecture, I want to talk about just some of the unique challenges of doing the government contracting work in Iraq and for Afghanistan. The third part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about money as a weapons system, which was kind of a new concept. And the idea was that we were going to spend a ton of money supporting our forces in doing reconstruction work in Iraq and in Afghanistan anyway. And was there a way to slightly change the way we did what we did to impact the campaign plan, to make a difference in the actual sort of fight? And that's what money as a weapon system is all about. And I've got several kind of concrete examples. Some of them I think are actually a little humorous, but they were pretty effective, and I'll share those with you. Finally, I want to talk about how to practice law in a stressful environment. It doesn't have to be a war zone. It can be any stressful environment. And these are sort of what I call personal adaptations or personal mitigations from both my deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they would work for any kind of work. You wouldn't have to be doing lawyer work. You could really be doing any thought work or, frankly, any work at all. And you wouldn't have to be deployed overseas, frankly. You could just be in a stressful environment. Work could be stressful. You could be sent away from home to practice law for 6 months. Any place where these stressors are coming your way, I think some of these tips may help you. So I've talked a little bit about environmental factors. I want to be sort of specific. So what are some of the differences that you encounter when you're practicing law in a combat zone or overseas? You're separated from your normal family, your routine, your pets. There is no Starbucks. You're not going out to get pizza. You're not going fishing. You're not going hunting. It's just anything that you might have done is turned upside down. You can get there from here, but you better count on 3 days. It took me about 4 days to travel from Norfolk, Virginia to Baghdad, Iraq. And it's pretty stressful travel, very austere conditions. You're moving about 200 pounds of equipment. And unlike the airports, there's not a lot of those little baggage wheel carts to carry them around. So you end up having to carry them yourself, or if you're smart and in a leadership position, maybe you can form a line and get everybody to pitch in and help. That's what we like to see, but it doesn't always work out that way. You're sleeping pretty rough. You're worried. You're pretty exhausted by the time you're getting ready to get there. There's looming danger reminders. So all during the travel, you're toting around weapons and body armor. When I was in Qatar, in Al Udeid, people are handing out nerve agent, tourniquets, and all kinds of scary things like that, and pills to take, and it's just not a very happy thing. When you land in Baghdad at the time, you don't land like a regular commercial jet lands. You land in this very tight corkscrew where you kind of spiral down to the airfield. And, you're really better off not asking why you're doing it, because the reason you're doing it is that in case someone starts shooting at the airplane, they're basically doing their complete landing pattern over the airfield so that they can control the space and the range of weapons to get to you is a little less. I'm going to show you the Rhino, but when you get there, wouldn't it be easy if you could just land in Baghdad and then go to the green zone? But they don't do it that way. You land at about 2 in the afternoon, and imagine after traveling for days to get there, they put you in a shack with 15 or 20 other people with all your gear, and you're told this thing called the Rhino is going to come get you at 2 or 3 in the morning and then take you in, which of course raises all kinds of questions. Well, if it's safe, why are we waiting to travel at 2 or 3 in the morning? And what is this Rhino? And what in the world is going on? And that's a stressor. Heat and sleep deprivation stress. At this point, you probably only slept 8 hours in the last 48 or 72. Many of you have experienced 125-degree temperatures. I had not until I went to Iraq. That was a whole different thing for me. And then there's what I call the newbie phenomenon. You don't know what's going on, and everyone else does, and they don't have a lot of patience to explain things to you. It's like they were new and they had to figure it out on their own, and as far as they're concerned, you can figure it out on your own too. And so it's a bit stressful not knowing completely what's expected of you or where you're going or what's going to happen next. On the plus side, I always call this, and if any of you have not watched Star Wars, I apologize, but there's a great scene in Star Wars. It's almost a cliche now. The bar scene in Star Wars where the hero meets all the aliens for the first time and sees all this amazing different shape of scenery and people. That was kind of like what Iraq and particularly Baghdad were for me. I think I counted 10 different foreign languages the first day. There were people from probably 15 different countries. Baghdad was a beautiful, overwhelming city, but there was also quite a bit of war damage. It really can be very disorienting. As a lawyer, when you get there, no matter how tired you are, as coming in as the new lawyer, your client's going to want to meet with you right away. And it's not going to be a totally pleasant meeting like, hi, how are you? We're so glad you're here. Your client is already going to try to set expectations and demands because they're very concerned. I mean, whether we like to acknowledge it or not, we as attorneys, we can help things tremendously, but we can screw things up tremendously too. And your client really wants to get a feel for you. Are you going to be an impediment to what he's trying to do, or are you going to be a help? And so in that meeting, he's going to try to gauge that, and you're going to know not very much, and you're going to be tired when you have that meeting. There's something called the info dump threat. So you're going to replace someone often in these situations. Imagine someone's been there for 5 months, and the only thing that they have to do before they can pat themselves on the back and congratulate themselves for a job well done is to tell you everything you need to know that it's taken them 5 months to learn. Often they will try to do that in the first 4 hours you were there because they want to check that block off their planner list and say, okay, I have now briefed my replacement. Now I can go to the bazaar and buy souvenirs or do whatever I want to do. And there you are on 3 hours of sleep, hearing these incredibly complex briefings that go on. And so you got to get a handle on that. Overseas and in many stressful legal environment, anytime people are traveling, it's not unusual to have less resources and people. I mean, you don't send more people than you need halfway across the world to Iraq. And so sometimes the people figuring out how many people it takes to do a job, they tend to err toward less rather than more. And so you're often going to be doing the job you're sent to do with less resources, less people. Language barriers. I talked about sort of the communication issues or the vast languages you're going to be exposed to. Well, if you're working with NATO countries and you're working with allies, there are different definitions of what fluent English is. I have a bit of an accent. Maybe some of you don't think I particularly speak fluent English, but you get accents or you get differing degrees of English and English skills, and you can have some serious communication barriers pretty quickly. Cultural challenges. And challenge is probably not the right word. I mean, people's culture is what it is. But when you're working in a Muslim country, there are different rules that you have to follow. Friday tends to be a more holy day than Sunday. Sunday is just a normal working day. there will be certain Muslim celebrations where they don't eat, they fast all day. And so if you're in a workplace with some Iraqi workers and they're in their holy fast, it is beyond rude for you to whip out a Diet Coke and your crackers and start, munching down at your office space. They're very much a gift-giving culture. Very generous. They want to shower you with gifts. They're so proud and happy you've come to their country. Well, in the United States government, in the military, there's rules as to how many gifts we can take from people. And so you're constantly struggling with, can I accept this gift? The rules say I really can't, but I'm looking at this Iraqi gentleman's eyes, and there's going to be big trouble if I don't take it. And so there's those kinds of challenges that you have to try to figure out how to navigate. The last one is really sort of funny, navigational challenges. So you imagine yourself in a strange city without a map. You're only going a few blocks, but people are saying, oh, you just go here, make a right. At the first blown out building, you hang a left, and then you go about 100 yards, and you'll see a couple of guards in front of the embassy and hang a right. And you've had 3 hours of sleep, and it won't take much more than that, and you're lost. I'll never forget a young captain who was working for me called the office in tears and had gotten herself lost. And I so wanted to go find her. It was the hardest thing I ever did. I had to just give her directions because I knew that if I couldn't give her confidence to get around the city, she was just going to have trouble. And so I had to just, kind of grit my teeth and shut my eyes and give her directions and let her kind of work through the navigational challenges. It sounds like a really trivial thing, but believe me, it's kind of not. Okay, so here are some environmental professional adaptations I think you can use in any situation like the ones I described. Control the information dump. Don't let your people tell you things faster than you can take them in as a lawyer. And this applies anywhere. I mean, if you're working on a big case or you're doing litigation and someone is trying to tell you things faster than you can take it in, why? It's for you. You control it. Set meetings, set a schedule, limit the amount of time you're going to do it, and then take charge and control it. And, it's not going to be easy. I remember when I went in, I was very firm about it. I set meetings. I said, we're going to do it this way. And then we'd be in the dining facility, and the guy I was replacing, who was a really nice guy, would see someone and go, oh, that reminds me, I have to tell you. And so I would always just smile at him and say, how about them dogs? Being a Georgia Bulldog fan. And after I did it the first 3 times, he would just kind of grimace and shake his head and realize that, nope, we were not in a time and my brain was not able to take it. And that may seem like an extreme example, but you have to control how fast people tell you things. You've got to control your client's expectations. You've got to fight hard when you're at your tiredest and you're least to not sign up to anything that you can't sign up to as the lawyer. I mean, you can't tell them something they want to do that's illegal is legal. At the same time, you have to come across as confident and positive. So I remember in my first meeting, the general was very concerned about fast turnaround. He'd had bad experiences with contract attorneys stateside, and he wanted to emphasize to me that he needed everything back reviewed within 1 day rather than 3 to 5 days. And that was very easy for me. I was like, that's fine. I'll do it in a day. I mean, if that's what you want, that's what you get. I mean, I may not do as thorough of a job, but I've been doing this a while. I can do it in a day. The other thing he wanted to talk about was a program called Iraqi First. And in that program, it was in essence a preference program to do business with Iraqi firms. Well, as the students I have who are on this call in my government contracts class know, preferences are a big deal, and Congress establishes preferences. And some generals in Iraq don't get to just decide that we're going to have a preference for Iraqi first. So the challenge there is, being exhausted with this general first meeting me was not the time to launch into why this was a terrible illegal idea. So you have to just be non-committal. Like, oh, well, that's an interesting program. I can't wait to hear more about that. And then you just sort of deal with it down the road, which I did. And, it was funny when we had the issue come up down the road, and I told the general, well, you legally, you really can't do this, and we're going to lose the protest. He already knew that. But I have a feeling that if I told him in that first meeting, it would not have been a good idea. This one's big. I would recommend you ignore the day-to-day work until you have a big picture plan. As long as someone else can do it for the first few days, let them and look at it. I've taken over a lot of organizations in my life, and I believe like that first 2 weeks when you come into a new organization, that's when you see the dysfunction or the things that can be improved. After you've been in a setting for a couple of weeks, you don't see dysfunction anymore. It's normal to you at that point. So I always challenge people who are coming into leadership positions or coming into new offices or confronting new legal situations. Take advantage of being a newbie. That's when you really want to give it that hard, honest look. Control the pace of the turnover. Those people who you're replacing are going to be there for a while. Let them work to their last day. They're getting paid to do that. It's not like you're goofing off. I mean, you're resting. You're getting yourself ready to assume the load. You're learning what you need to do. They're not entitled to a 3-day vacation at the end of their tour. Now, if you say, I have this, I'm ready, believe me, they will take a vacation, because although I encouraged my relief at the end of my tour to do exactly what I'm saying, he was a hard-charging Army guy, said, I got it. And so I was in the bazaar my last 3 days. But I would tell you that is not the best way to do it for taking over an organization. First things first, before you get caught up in the minutiae, you really need to think about what's most important. And I'll give you a great example when I took over this contract law office in Iraq. The people who were there before me had gotten notified that the Air Force wasn't planning on sending any more attorneys because they were claiming they didn't have any. And so starting October 1st, we weren't going to get 2 of our attorneys. We were going to be 2 people down. And the people who were there were very unconcerned about it. They were very frantic doing the end of the fiscal year contract work. And again, those of you who've had the contract law course know that because the government fiscal year ends September 30th, September tends to be a very busy month for contracting because everybody's trying to spend their last dollars. And so they were sort of worried about that. As soon as I heard that situation where really for 5 months of my tour, I might be 2 people down, I will tell you that became my number one priority. It only took me a couple of hours to deal with that, to have a couple of unpleasant phone calls, to make it clear that it was unacceptable not to send people to a wartime tasking. And then it was solved, and we got the people a couple of weeks late, but we got them. If I hadn't taken the time to do first things first, the odds are I would have gone my whole tour there with 2 less people in an already undermanned legal office. So it's very important when you come in, I think, to do first things first. Finally, you got to find the people who can help you. They might be friends who practice the same kind of law you have. In my setting, there were attorneys stateside who worked for the Department of Defense, worked for the Army, who really were supposed to be there for me to help or to provide help to me. And so it was just a question of me making contact with them, letting them know where I was. The Corps of Engineers was located in Baghdad, and they had 4 very underemployed attorneys. Well, no one told me about that. I just wandered around and found them. And they were also available to be a source of help if I needed them. Before you jump in, make sure your work area is set up and you're reasonably settled. There's a lot of in-processing that has to be done. Don't charge in. While you're doing your deep thinking, I think it's really important to think about what the big picture client expectations are. Not the trivial, not what they necessarily told you. You may have to talk to different levels of clients, not just your head client. You may want to talk to some of the attorneys who've been there before you, not just the ones who are there right now, but the ones who preceded them. It's really worth doing a little bit of research and understanding, what are the expectations, because it's a lot easier to meet them if you know what they are. It's very important to display competence early. Everyone is worried and watching you when you come into a new legal job like that. I'm a big believer. You pick something easy and you do it great. First impressions are really key. Finally, you got to show respect for the local conditions, but you also have to show you're not a slave to them. You have your own principles, workflow, et cetera. The way I would probably put this a couple different ways. You respect what's happened in the past, but you're not a wimp. You still have principles. You're not just going to roll over because, that's the way it's always been done, but you're not going to insist on doing it the way you used to do it stateside either. It's kind of a tough balancing act, but it's really kind of important to get it right. Okay, so this is the famous rhino, and this ridiculous picture is me trying to do an impression of a rhino holding onto the rhino. You can see it's a big armored vehicle, and you pile into that in the middle of the night, and that's the vehicle that you use to get back and forth often between the Green Zone in Baghdad and Baghdad International Airport or Camp Victory. If you're not using that, you're using a helicopter. And so that is a picture of the rhino. So be it. Okay, let's talk about some fun government contract things. Often, I think that's probably why a lot of you are here. So, when you do government contracts in Iraq, you can imagine I was doing all the same kind of things that I was doing stateside. I was doing construction contracts for buildings. I was procuring office supplies, computers, weapons, vehicles, all of the normal things. And so rather than talk about sort of the things that you would normally buy, I picked out a few sort of interesting things that took up a lot of my time while I was there. Free cigarettes for detainees. So without boring you to death about government fiscal law, there's actually an interesting principle that the government's funds can't be used for personal employee expenses. I'm a government worker, but they don't buy my clothes and they don't feed me. They don't buy my house for me. They don't buy my car. Those are personal expenses that I, as an individual, are expected to bear. And so government funds can't be used for that. So cigarettes, fortunately, that's one of the few bad habits I don't have, and I don't smoke. But for government workers who do smoke, I can assure you there is no way to use government funds for cigarettes. So when we got a request to buy a ton of cigarettes for Iraqi detainees, bad guys who were basically being detained until we figured out whether they were POWs, terrorists, or really what their status was, had traditionally been given cigarettes. And they had noticed they were running out and they were in a great big hurry to get them. And this hit right at the end of the fiscal year. And of course, my office said no. I didn't even know when they originally said no. It was such a routine thing. It didn't even get to my level. I was at a conference. It was after the end of the fiscal year. Work had slowed down and the Joint Contracting Command was having a conference. When the chief of staff came and dragged me out and said there was a very irate Army general who needed to see me urgently. So I'll never forget this. I walked outside by a picnic table and he started berating me about the cigarettes. And I kind of politely explained that I couldn't buy them for U.S. people. There's no way I can buy them for detainees. And he started to emphasize how it was a very important security threat and that he was going to have big problems controlling the detainees, if he didn't provide them with the cigarettes. I was probably not at my best, and I remember kind of rolling my eyes and saying, well, why don't you just lock all the doors, Just lock them in their cells until you figure this out, which probably wasn't the best thing to say to a general officer as a lieutenant colonel, but, I was tired. That's why you should sleep. He said, you're thinking Supermax. I need you to think Hogan's Heroes. I was kind of taken back. And I said, well, sir, do you mean they're all like wandering around? Because that's exactly what I mean. I was like, wow. And then we talked a little further and I said, well, again, I hate to be snarky, but can't you just buy more machine guns, more barbed wire? And he said, well, I probably can, but it'll take me a while and I'm going to run out of cigarettes in a couple of days. Some light bulb went on in my head and I realized that we had an emergency situation where we actually had life or property in danger, which is one of the exceptions that will allow you to do strange things in fiscal law that you can't otherwise do. And so I was able to come up with a way where we could buy cigarettes for 2 months for detainees, and the general went off happy. And I think he never solved his problem. He basically took the 2 months of cigarettes that the Joint Contracting Command bought him, and then he found, I think, some different contract that we didn't control and got some more cigarettes under that. Procurement of guard services mercenaries. May surprise you, but many of the bases over in Iraq in 2006, 2007 were actually not guarded by American service members. They were guarded by contractors. And the issue became, if you're talking about a security contractor checking ID with a pistol, that's probably not an issue. If you're talking about a contractor who has mortars, heavy machine guns, and anti-tank weapons, you start to get into issues with the law of armed conflict. Is this a lawful combatant? Is this someone who's legally under the United Nations treaties that we, by the way, have signed, Geneva Convention, Hague Convention? Are they a legitimate combatant? And where that's not a pure procurement question, it was sure part of my life for a couple of weeks. Construction surveillance challenges. Fight for reasonableness in building 2006 structures for 1940 society. What's going on here? Well, many of you know we spent billions upon billions of dollars doing reconstruction in Iraq. It was a good thing to do. It was, helping the society support the new government. But some of the challenges were the security situation would ebb and flow, and we would often find situations where we could not get to a building, or the contractor couldn't get to the building, or a building was damaged after they had started. And the fight for reasonableness became like, well, can the government enforce its deadline in a situation where enemy action prevents the contractor from working? the contractor has a duty to secure the building, but isn't that really against vagrancy? Do we really expect the contractor to secure the building against a determined attack by Al-Qaeda? And so if Al-Qaeda does attack and, I don't know, blow up a hospital or a prison that's being built, can we really hold them responsible? Sometimes my clients would want to, and the fight for reasonableness was me having to try to explain, like, really, I don't think I can take that case. Building 2006 structures for a 1940 society, often in our hurry to build the best we could for the Iraqis, we did not take into account the maintenance practices at the time. And one really sad story was we had a building that was suddenly leaking. We researched what was happening, and Iraq is a very dusty country. The drains in the floors were getting covered by dirt, and the Iraqis were cleaning them with lengths of rebar. And in shoving the rebar into the drain, they were putting holes into the plastic water pipes and causing the leakage. Because nobody had ever explained the situation, how to maintain a building like that, and that's just one example. Contract administration, all of the stuff that happens after contract formation was a weak link in general. The focus very much was awarding contracts and not so much in what happened afterwards. And so we often had performance problems, and we would come in and try to deal with them after the fact. Because the reality was there were only 3 or 4 people. There were about 250 people concentrating on awarding contracts. There were only about 4 or 5 people, who were worried about what happened after the contract was awarded. Funding challenges. The commanders over there were always trying to be aggressive, do smart things. There's a pot of money called Commander's Emergency Response Program money. This money was basically set up for if a group of GIs were going through a village and they accidentally shot the village cow, they could whip out money and put it in the villagers' hands so that they would not feel bad toward the coalition and would be less likely to hurt coalition members. It was to sort of make things right on the spot, which was a good program. Some of the higher level commanders, though, decided that if that was a good idea, even a better idea would be to take all that money in their large organizations, put it together, and do things like putting in a wireless system for the entire city of Ramadi. In other words, rather than stringing new telephone wire, why don't we just put wireless in and we'll have everybody in Ramadi use cell phones? And Ramadi and Fallujah were key terrain in the fight in 2006 and 2007. And we were desperately trying to get things settled down there. And so I spent a lot of time arguing, frankly, with other lawyers that although this program may be against the spirit of the CERP or the Commander Emergency Response Program, it was not against the law. Finally, protests and claims. Again, those of you who've gotten to take the government contracts class or have experience in the area know that our contractors can challenge our award decisions or how we award contracts in protests, or if they don't like the way a contract was administered or if they think it was changed, they can file a claim. Just think of them as litigation. Well, the interesting challenge in Iraq is you're really not manned to do litigation or protests. And so what you have to do is there are people stateside who can help you, but rather than doing it yourself, you have to figure out how to do a handoff, how to support them, how to make sure they have the information they need so that you can be successful. And it's not quite as much work as doing it yourself, but it almost is. And that's, I think, one of the challenges. And most of us are used to just doing it ourselves, and that makes it kind of difficult. So what are some of the other issues? Boy, wouldn't it be easy if you could just do government contract law? While I was there was an investigation from a bribery case that affected one of our folks from a previous deployment. After being questioned for about 14 hours, the person was left alone. Unfortunately, they gave them their handgun back. Sadly, the person killed themselves. And the next morning, I had all kinds of government contracts work to do, and I spent 8 hours determining whether or not someone in that situation, whether it was appropriate to bury them in Arlington Cemetery. Now, why in the world I was the lawyer in Iraq, being a government contracts attorney, opining on the appropriateness of a burial in Arlington Cemetery, I'll never to this day know. But I got on the phone with people. We figured out the answer was yes. The person wasn't convicted of anything. The fact that they had taken their own life wasn't a disqualifier. And we issued an opinion that they could. And we had to do it that day because the family was making plans. And we didn't want to get crossways with Arlington, but we didn't want to traumatize the family either. And that's just an example of sort of the crazy issues that will come up in a deployment or perhaps any stressful legal situation where you're understaffed. I alluded to the problems I had getting attorneys from the Air Force, prying procurement attorneys away from stateside commands. So you have to picture this conversation. I'm a reserve Air Force lieutenant colonel talking to an active duty general officer in the Air Force. His position of power is considerably greater than mine, and I'm having to politely explain to him that it is absolute BS that he doesn't have procurement attorneys that he can send to the war zone. And so we're doing this sort of bizarre negotiation where I have to get to yes without a lot of power and sort of have to use my wiles and sort of persuade him and not really say what I think, which is, you got a wartime tasking, send the people over, leave me alone, I've got work to do. But, that's not the way it could work. The challenge of zero program management. I mean, those of you, again, who've had the government contracts class or experience know that the attorney and the contracting officers are one small part of the procurement team. There's a lot more people involved. Well, they're pretty much the team in Iraq because the program people are the people who are saying what they want are Army officers who are commanding Army commands in combat, and they don't have time to be program managers or to do the work that normally a program manager would do, i.e. what's the requirement, how should we be procuring it, working with the contracting officer to make some of the basic decisions. And so in addition to being shorthanded, you often end up having to do more work. Sending a friend to Afghanistan for the good of the cause. So we had 4 attorneys in Iraq, and we were supporting Iraq and Afghanistan. We were supporting Afghanistan virtually. I thought we were doing a pretty good job. I visited. I asked them what they had going on. They told me. At least 5 things they told me about required legal review. I hadn't seen any of them. I politely asked about that. I got some really sheepish looks. I realized they hadn't been legally reviewed. I said, okay, no harm, no foul. Got my general to make it clear that we needed to do legal review. 2 months later, I was visiting Afghanistan with the general again. Ran into the exact same scenario. This time, the guy sheepishly admitted to me, he said, well, I did get legal review. I had a buddy from back home who's a lawyer, and he was in the DFAC, and I brought my contract into the dining facility, and I went and got him ice cream, and he did the review while we ate ice cream. Now, this attorney was a fine man, 2 years of experience, none in government contracts. At that point, I realized that sometimes you have to have your lawyer face-to-face. And that rather than fight it, I was going to call a friend of mine who was scheduled to deploy to Baghdad and explain to them that they were really be going to Kabul. Thank goodness the person's still a good friend of mine, so it all worked out for the best. Iraqi employee safety and culture issues. Imagine you have somebody working for you as an Iraqi and they're a great translator, but all of a sudden you find out that the civil war aspects of the conflict are so great that there's a good possibility that if they go and translate in the wrong meeting, the militia might show up at their house and kill them. And so at that point, I became the arbiter of what meetings they could translate at and what meetings they couldn't translate at, which again is quite a long ways from being a government contract attorney. We had an Iraqi paralegal. Her safety outside the fence in the green zone became an issue. She was undergoing some harassment when she came in, some stone throwing. And so we had to deal with that with some proactive security measures. But, again, we didn't want to go too far and set it up too much so that then there would be a reprisal, or if we showed too much interest, she would become a target. And again, you just never know. The ever-present IG threat is, I'm going to briefly talk about in the next slide. We were doing some kind of unique things. And so we were pushing the envelope, and there was always a fear that someday, an IG was going to come knock at our door. I just thought this was a really cool throne, one of Saddam's thrones. Want to just have a couple pictures, so there we have it. Next thing I want to talk about really briefly, money as a weapon system. This was a great concept, that basically stood for the idea that we were going to spend all this money in Iraq and Afghanistan anyway. What were some ways we could spend it that would sort of make the coalition be in better shape, that would reduce the number of military-age Iraqi males who would, plant a roadside bomb, do some sniping? And what we discovered is, that an Iraqi who had a job was a lot less likely to take $20 from someone to bury an artillery shell on the road some dark night. So, first thing, Iraqi First program. And as I alluded to, it wasn't really legal, but it was very important. The more Iraqi contractors we had doing the work that could do the work, the better for the coalition, the more Iraqis who would be employed and not want to hurt us. But as you know, it wasn't a congressionally mandated program. Interestingly enough, several years after I left this line of work, it became a congressionally appropriate preference. And so now there is a legal Iraqi and Afghan first program, but there wasn't at the time. So this was one of these interesting lawyer struggles where what my client and I basically worked out was, I wasn't an IG. I wasn't going to report it, but he couldn't ask me to say it was legal because it wasn't. And if we got an IG complaint, he was on his own. I couldn't say it was legal. I wasn't going to call the IG, but my legal advice was going to be it wasn't legal. And if we got a protest or any kind of litigation, he was going to have to settle it and make it go away by awarding to the U.S. firm because it wasn't legal. And I think that made him happy because, frankly, most things weren't challenged. Many U.S. firms weren't interested in the work, and the work went to Iraqis, and it worked out great. Preference for manual labor clause. In some of our construction and earth-moving clauses, I actually drafted a clause that said that we would prefer people not use bulldozers and earth-moving equipment, but rather they would hire 100 Iraqis with a shovel rather than 2 with a bulldozer, because that's 98 more Iraqis who have jobs and are less likely to want to blow us up. We developed an Iraqi water contractor. I could go on for a while on this, but I won't because of time. Basically, all of our water was being shipped across the border from Kuwait, which meant a lot of convoys and a lot of danger. And smart people decided, wouldn't it be great if we had a firm right in Baghdad that would provide bottled water to the coalition? And there was an Iraqi firm that did bottled water, but they were in no position to comply with all the regulations and requirements of a government contract. And so what we all had to do was sort of take our government hat off and put our contractor hat on, and in essence work as the unpaid business staff and legal team for the Iraqi contractor to try to bring them up to speed such that we can award a contract to them and get all those soldiers off the road guarding convoys bringing water in from Kuwait. And we were successful while I was there and actually got the Iraqi water company up and got rid of the convoys. But it was kind of interesting because rather than looking at what the contractor, how the contractor was going to comply with our government requirements, we were actually figuring that for him. The next one's kind of one of my favorites. So we would do these operations called sweeps, where a brigade of Army soldiers would kick doors down, shoot windows out, go into an area, try to find all the bad guys. After they found all the bad guys, then we would turn it over to the Iraqi forces with the idea it was clear. Well, you can imagine if you were an Iraqi and you're minding your own business and you haven't done anything wrong and some knucklehead kicks your door down and shoots out your street light, you might not have been a terrorist before, but you're willing to learn. And so what we decided to do in the Joint Contracting Command was to put contracts in place that literally right behind the guys with the guns kicking the doors in, we had locksmiths and light repairmen. And so literally as soon as they went to the next house, we had a guy there hanging a new door, putting light bulbs back in. And rather than it being a negative, it became kind of a positive because the Iraqis knew they had bad people living in their neighborhood and we had to get them out. But by them not being inconvenienced with a kicked down door and no lights. And I'll tell you, if you live in a place like Baghdad, having street lights is like a lot more important than like a place like Jacksonville. I mean, I don't care how high crime your city is. I'm not saying Jacksonville is, but when you're a place like Baghdad, having street lights is life and death. So it was a big deal. So reconstruction, promises and challenges. It built a lot of support that we did a lot of reconstruction in Iraq. There was also, in essence, though, I think sometimes when you do too much for people, you can sometimes run into a little bit of a loss of respect. So there were challenges that way too. The buildings not being maintained, guarded, it was sort of the good and the bad. We hired a lot of local Iraqis to support us. We gave them a lot of jobs. That was great. We saved a lot of lives, frankly. On the other hand, I remember coming to work one day and not being let in my building and said to go back to my billeting and come to work the next day. And that's all they told me. And I'm not going to argue with a day off in a combat zone. I went back and I came back the next day. And what I found out was our computer contractors had been discovered with explosives and they had access to all the walls and, the spaces behind the walls. And so there was a concern, that we might blow up because in their rooms in the green zone, they had supposedly been vetted, they found explosives. And so again, the good and the bad. Okay, so moving right along, because as I promised, I'm going to shut up in a couple minutes and we're going to do questions. So these are pretty self-evident, but I think they're important. So these are your personal adaptations. Anytime you're in a stressful legal environment, and particularly a combat zone, sleep or be stupid. I mean, there's no substitute for sleep. You're not a hero. You're not impressing anybody. You've got to get sleep when you're doing thought work or you're wasting your time. Keep the home fires burning bright. It might be inconvenient to arrange for vet care, to arrange for a new air conditioner. You might think, why am I doing this and why isn't my wife doing it? But if you have the ability to do things that help people help back home, it's worth doing. You do not want to be in a combat zone with things not right back home. You got to do things for yourself. I had an opportunity to go to a day of Saddam Hussein's trial. I was able to travel a lot. As I mentioned, they serve lobster in the embassy dining facility 2 nights a week. So I mandated that one meal, everyone in my office had to be there. No excuses. And we made lobster night a fun night. So my rules were you had to be there, no excuses unless you were sick, and no work was going to be discussed. And that was my time to make sure that everybody was more or less happy, good, no one had problems at home, and kind of just a relaxed time. Dining facility shopping. There were like 15 different DFACs in the green zone. My office had a vehicle. It was safe to drive around the green zone. So we would go to this one for pizza, this one for steak, this one for lobster. It's just something to break the routine up. There was a bazaar. We did shopping. You go to movies. Green zone sightseeing. A lot of cool sights to see in the green zone. It's important to do fitness. I went to yoga classes, did road races. My knees wish I hadn't done road races now, but heck, I did them anyway. I'll be honest with you. I was not brave enough to do a dodgeball tournament. I watched one. I thought it was pretty funny, but I really did not need a 22-year-old, 240-pound Marine who looked like he could pitch Major League Baseball throwing a dodgeball at me. You saw the swimming pools. They were absolutely fabulous. I love swimming laps. That was both my fitness and my recreation. So that fitness is key. Faith in something bigger than you. Some reasonable way to manage the danger is critical. You're going to laugh, but I just realized I was in a large city. I figured out how many auto accidents and normal deaths there were in a large city. I looked at how many people had died or been hurt in the green zone the 6 months before I got there. And to my surprise, my odds were higher to get hurt in Atlanta than in the green zone. And so I just said, okay, it's like I'm in Atlanta for the next 6 months. And for whatever stupid reason, that worked for me. And I was able to walk around and not worry so much when the mortars fell or someone got shot at the BX from a sniper a mile away, just shooting up in the air, or when my roommate came home one day and found a hole in the top of our trailer and a bullet on his bed. But whatever it takes, you just got to find some way to reasonably manage it. This is one of the biggest ones next. Humor, humor, humor. You've got to find a way to make things funny, to get a laugh every day. If it got to be midday and we hadn't laughed about something, then I tried to figure out some clown thing I could do to make people laugh, because I just think that you've got to have humor in a stressful situation. Personal relationships, your workmates or your family, you treat them that way. You need to treat them that way. Let people back home help. They want to send stuff. They want to connect. Everyone needs to be part of a big effort, whether it's a war or a big legal project. You know, if you got sent to Alaska to do the new oil pipeline contract, it'd be similar. Let people back home help and send things. Treasure the time. I was big on like taking a lot of pictures, and I would have shown you a lot more. But unfortunately, when I was running around Iraq, I did not get permission from all the people that I took pictures of to say, hey, I might use this in a Florida coastal presentation 15 years from now. So unfortunately, I couldn't show you many of my great pictures. It's too bad. Bought some keepsakes. Sleep and take time off. I know I said that twice. It's because it's that important. Finally, if you're in charge of anything in a stressful situation, war is just an example. War is hard. If you're in charge, you don't have to be. When I was in the Army infantry, I met a special forces officer, and he said something that's always stuck with me. He basically said, look, it's easy to be hard. It's hard to be smart. And that's always been my sort of go-to. So with that, 2 minutes late. I've left about 8 minutes, but we started a little bit late, right, Margaret? So hopefully Margaret won't yell at me too much. And so we have some time for some questions.
I'm not going to yell at all. Actually, Professor Caine, I laughed a couple of times during your presentation, so I think everyone can see your sense of humor even through the online platform. Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. Before I start talking and moving on to the next slides about upcoming online events that we're having, I wanted to pause and see if anybody had any questions. And there have been some chats that I've been having with folks during the webinar, so just so that everybody knows, we actually will be sending out a link to today's recording as well as the slide deck from today's video, so everyone should get that within the next day or two. So if you even just registered for today's event but couldn't participate live, you'll be getting the recording as well. And I've got a couple of questions for you, Professor Caine, while folks are waiting. If anyone is interested in see, of course you can count on me for questions. If anyone has questions about careers in government contracts, so if somebody, was inspired by your presentation, is interested in learning more about the field of government contracts, what recommendations would you have?
Probably the best way to get into government contracts, I think, is with the government, the civilian sector mostly, not the military. Certainly, people join the military as JAGs and do government contracting. But the normal routine is if you're a judge advocate or an officer, military attorney, out of your first 4 years, you're mostly going to do basic stuff for at least the first 2. And even if you're a government contracts attorney at a base, you're only going to do a little. So typically, the military government contracts people have to put 8 or 9 years in before they get experience. When I worked for the Navy as a civilian attorney, for my first 3 years, I did nothing else but government contracts. Certainly, there are private sector and corporate jobs. On the private sector, law firms tend to be very focused on academic credentials, and if you can meet that bar, that's certainly a fine thing to do. The other way to go into law firms is after you have the experience, and so you already sort of have the experience by that time, so that's probably not a very good answer. Corporations tend to only hire experienced people. The government hires a lot of new people and trained people because the government has a ton. The good news I always give, and my students have heard this, I go to conferences with many, many government contracts attorneys, and I go to one every year. There's probably 1,000 people there. I'm old. They're older than me. There's going to be a lot of turnover in the government contracts field in the next 3 to 5 years. So even if you've had some trouble breaking in with a government agency and getting a job right now, I would say persist, hang in there, because I swear it's going to be a couple years from now, and you're going to go to some government office, and it's going to look like a ghost town. We're all going to left and gone to retirement at the same time. And most of my counterparts are not going to be interested in staying. We're like, I'm really sorry you didn't plan ahead and hire some more new attorneys, but I'm still going to Wyoming. So hope that answers it, Margaret.
That does. That's great. And then another question, for anyone interested in breaking into the field of government contracts, do you have to be a licensed attorney? Do you need to pass the bar exam, or are there opportunities for folks that maybe have a background in law and compliance and government contracts but don't need a bar necessarily?
So by now, I think many of you probably realize that Margaret was an All-American athlete at University of Southern California on volleyball, setting up these great sets for me to spike. So that was a great one. Thank you, Margaret. So the answer is no.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.
And in fact, the answer is not only no, you don't have to be an attorney. There's such a wonderful career field, contracting officers, that I actually encourage attorneys to pursue it as well as people who aren't attorneys. The contracting officer career field, the people who actually negotiate, prepare the contracts, negotiate the disputes, it's a very sophisticated career field. They frankly are almost lawyers. They work at a high level of sophistication. Their grade level or pay is frankly comparable to attorneys. Their status in the government is very similar. I highly recommend that as a career field. Also, in my talk, you heard me talk about program managers. Often there'll be some requirement that you have, maybe an IT background, an engineering background. You have to know something about the thing that you're buying, but that's also a very good career field. So there are many ways to get into the acquisition business without being an attorney. And the neat thing about the acquisition business is it tends to be a team. It's a team game. It really is. And we're all just part of a team. And so we all sort of work together. It's not like, oh, the attorney is way up here and everybody else is down here. No, it is very much a team, and you don't have to be an attorney to play.
Wonderful. And see, I knew questions would come in. Usually this is what happens. So we've gotten some that came through privately to the presenters. So one of these questions is from someone who's interested in getting information about doing government contract work overseas. So if you have any information about that, Professor Caine, and anything that relates specifically to veterans or to citizens, and then what are the security clearance issues as well?
Well, I mean, the security clearance issue is driven by the work to be done on the contract. I mean, if the contract requires security clearance, then it becomes a matter of, getting people to do the clearance, whether they're overseas or stateside. And it becomes sort of a process somewhat outside my control. I'm not a security clearance professional. I think that we do clear, in some cases, people to do work overseas. I don't know about the citizenship requirements. I know it's an issue, but I would say the work drives it. As far as just in general terms, we hire a lot of overseas contractors. I mean, for goodness sakes, we hired a ton of overseas contractors in Iraq, and a lot of the government's needs. The security clearance isn't even an issue, and frankly, U.S. firms don't even want to play. The transportation costs of getting the goods and services there are so far away. So I can tell you there is a lot of opportunity. The security clearance issue, I think you got to play a little bit by ear. I wish I could give you a more complete answer.
Okay, and then actually a follow-up from that, and maybe others have this question as well, is, if they've got additional questions, who can they contact? Professor Caine has graciously, offered to answer questions by email as well. So when we send out the PDF for today's presentation and the recording link, we will also include Professor Caine's email address as well, and you can reach out to him. And of course, you can reach out to any member of our team as well, and our contact information will be up here as well. We've got another question that came in, and this is related to jurisdiction. So in your government contract experience in Baghdad, was Iraqi law applicable, or what was the jurisdiction for any contract claims?
Iraqi law was absolutely not applicable. However, they still gave me an Iraqi attorney to work in my office anyway, the man I mentioned who became sort of the premier translator, which I never really understood why that was the case. But no, whenever we spend U.S. funds, U.S. appropriated funds, it's always U.S. law. The jurisdiction is the Contract Disputes Act, and that's the jurisdiction that allows them to file claims. Protests, the jurisdiction is the Competition and Contracting Act. But whenever the United States is contracting, the actual contracting portion of it is always going to be governed by United States law. Now, the performance on the ground, the labor laws, the applicable how people do the job, safety requirements. There could be aspects of host nation or Iraqi law that govern that aspect, but in the actual my business of forming the contract, no. But, I will tell you, karma got a revenge on me, because when I went to Afghanistan, I was not in the contracts business. I was the chief rule of law for the International Security Assistance Force. And so I spent my entire 6 months learning all about Afghani law. So I was trapped in that law my second deployment. So even though I got to avoid Iraqi law, karma came around and got me.
Thank you. Before we move on, there's time for one last question. If anyone has one, again, you can use the chat feature, or you could unmute your microphone and ask us live. And while we're waiting for any more questions to come in, our contact information is available here. Again, I'm Margaret Ioannidis. With us today was Jim Caine, and we will be sending out his email address after the presentation. For anyone who's interested in learning more about our online LLM programs, please visit our website. As we mentioned, Professor Caine also teaches the 3-credit Government Contracts and Procurement course in our Logistics and Transportation LLM program. For any of you who are in our U.S. Law LLM program and you're interested in auditing the course, you're able to do so. Of course, this is also available as one of the electives in our General Law Studies LLM program. Our next speaker series event is going to be on Wednesday, November 9th at noon. That presentation will be of interest for anyone who is considering taking a bar exam in the United States. Professor Doug Helsing will be covering the topic of bar exam here, and he's going to focus more in depth on, planning ahead for taking the bar exam with a focus on foreign educated attorneys or applicants. For those of you who are currently in our LLM programs, our next faculty student hangout will be Friday, October 21st from 12 to 1. Professor Lee Scales, who teaches professional responsibility, will be our guest speaker that day, and she will be focusing on strategies for passing the MPRE. Again, for any of you who are interested in taking the bar exam in the United States, you also need to pass the MPRE exam in order to be licensed, and so she is going to be focusing on that as well. That is a private event, but again, students, be on the lookout in your D2L class sites. We'll be posting about that as a news item and also emailing you as well. So without further ado, if there are any final questions, please ask them now, or otherwise you can email them to Professor Caine or to any member of the LLM team, and we'll do our best to answer them. And so, Professor Caine, thank you for taking the time. This was another wonderful presentation. I can always count on you for an informative and entertaining presentation, and one that will definitely make me laugh at least a couple of times. Any final thoughts, Professor Caine?
No, I saw one question I could answer really quickly. It was whether I knew a couple people. Unfortunately, the person who asked the question, I did not know either of the two gentlemen that the gentleman I was asked about.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay. Any final thoughts, Jim? All right. So with that said, thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us from around the world, and we hope that you'll be able to join us at our next speaker series events. For our students, please make sure you participate in the live review sessions that your professors are doing. I know that some of those have already been scheduled. We're right around the middle of the semester, so please make sure to participate in those live review sessions. Also, make sure that you're completing the attendance quizzes at the end of each module. And if you've got any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to a member of the LLM team or to your professors directly. We hope that you all have a great afternoon, morning, evening, night, depending on where you are around the world, and look forward to seeing you again online. Thank you.